agriculture is more connected to other sectors in society than any other sector, I think. So therefore, I think agriculture needs to be discussed by others than agronomists. Okay, for example, we have over 500 dead zones in the oceans, almost outside every river estuary in the world where there is a lot of agriculture inland is suffering from very poor water quality and so forth. And I have difficulty seeing how we can solve problems in the oceans without changing things on land, and particularly in agriculture. That's just one example of this interconnectedness, and that agriculture needs to be discussed widely in society. I am very interested and inspired by a particular the American sociologist Eric Olin Wright, who unfortunately passed away only a few years ago, and his seminal work on envisioning real utopias. Envisioning real utopias was his sort of grand project over many decades, trying to figure out a strategy for how research could become more active in promoting social change towards sustainability. And of course, it's kind of play with words, because utopias are something that is, utopia is something that can never be achieved. But he wanted to have a strategy for actually make utopias real. That's why envisioning real utopias. And he says the strategy to do this is in 3 steps. The first step is the theoretically informed critique of the existing system. And what is important here, I think, is theoretically informed critique. So it means that if the system under study now is, of course, agriculture. So instead of just critique it from the individual phenomena, let's say that here is a field, it's leaking nutrients. Here is a field that suffers from drought. Here we have a problem that our weed management is actually interfering with pollinators. That's not a theoretically informed critique, but that's sort of a critique based on the individual observations. What he suggests is you need to add also a theoretically informed critique of the entire system. Step 2, once you have done that, you've showed that the current way of doing things is not good. Then next step is, what alternatives could there be? And could they be, first of all, of course, they need to be desirable. It means that they must be better than one we have. They must be viable. It means that they should work over a long time. They should not have any negative side effects and so forth. And if you can show that they are desirable and viable, then you have to ask the question, are they achievable? And this is, of course, where I will rely on Tim, talking a lot about this step 2. Once we have done that, then we have to think about what strategy could make the utopia real. So this is a fairly simple 3-pronged approach, but I think it is should be a very valuable approach to follow in research towards a perennial vision. Most of the work is, of course, engaged in step 2, but it's so important to put that into the bigger picture. So I will say a few words about step 1. I will hand over to Tim to talk about step 3. And then when he is done, I will continue and talk about step 3, what strategy could be made, could make the real utopias real. So first, the informed critique of the existing. What is important, I think, is to find out what is the key driver of the unsustainability of current agriculture. And if we really try to drill down into this and find the key driver, I think, or at least I have come to the conclusion that the heavy dominant use of annual plants is a key driver, perhaps the key driver to most of the unsustainability, both the environmental, the social, and the economic unsustainability of current agriculture. And I think it's important to then look particularly at the interaction of the current agricultural practices, which are based on growing annual plants, and how these practices interact with financial, that means sort of the businesses, regulatory, that's EU policy if we are in Europe, for example, and political interests of particular groups in society. And how do these drivers interact with the natural processes, including soil health, for example? So this, I think, is a very valid area of research that could be, there's a lot of things done, but we seldom see the big picture of a theoretically informed critique of agriculture. To some extent because of the way we organize our universities to deal with particular subcomponents. Very few people are actually engaged in putting these pieces together. We'll just very briefly go through some of the main problems of agriculture as a note where I think the use of annual plants is the key driver. Erosion, nutrient leakage, that we have to disrupt the ecological processes once a year, once a season in other parts of the world. We're losing carbon because the way we manage our soils. Weeds is a particular problem that we need to handle, to manage it. And the way we manage it is highly detrimental to a lot of natural ecosystems. And it's extremely energy consuming and from a farmer's perspective, time consuming. If you ask any farmer what is the biggest problem he or she would have in the springtime, and say time. They don't have time to do all the things that needs to be done, and most of that can be boiled down to this use of annual plants that requires a lot of time. We are not really improving a lot our system. If you take a big picture view on agriculture here, I show how much wheat we produce per ton of phosphorus and nitrogen input. Phosphorus in solid lines, and we have 3 countries. We have Denmark, Sweden, and France. You can see that Denmark seems to be doing quite well. They were increasing the phosphorus productivity quite a lot from the late 80s and up to, then we had a price hike. Here is a the phosphorus price over time. You had this peak in 2008 when all this this spike here, and then we're actually seeing a declining efficiency from this. And in terms of nitrogen, we haven't done much progress, and it looks like the last couple of years we are actually reducing our efficiency in this view. What is also, it's well known in agricultural economic circle that agricultural treadmill theory is a description of the mechanism that drive agriculture into an increasingly unsustainable manner. I won't go into detail with this, but I will illustrate it. So if we look at the production of crops in the solid green line, that is the value of food grains from the 1930 onwards until 2022, in real money. So the value of the produce, food grains, since the 1980s actually gone down to about 50%, while the external inputs here illustrated with 3 seed purchase, fertilizer, and pesticide have increased rapidly. And of course, this widening gap between what it costs to produce something and what you can earn from what you produce, this is, of course, it's an illustration of the agricultural treadmill theory. This heavy use of annual plants also means that that results in a very expensive operation, and it's so expensive that governments in the world find it necessary to support it. So here we show the subsidies, and we can see for the last 10 years, we are actually increasing or making no progress, or even increasing to some extent the subsidies, which I think we shall come back to later on when we're talking about a strategy for achieving the perennial vision, what is behind the change of direction of these subsidies about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. So I claim that the winners of or the beneficiaries of the agricultural subsidies is primarily the agrochemical industry. It's definitely not farmers. It might be landowners who don't farm, but primarily the agriculture input industry is benefiting enormously and really trying to maintain the subsidies as they are. So step 2, what could the alternative be then? That would be desirable, viable, and achievable. So desirable for who and for what? Viable, would it work without negative side effect? What would it take to make it happen? And this is where I would like to hand over to Tim. I end with some of the beautiful examples of potential perennial grain crops. So if I will say one thing first about this perennial vision, because as I see it, we have to look over sort of well into the future. So we can say that the perennial cropping systems, I hope that Tim will convincingly show that they are very, very desirable in the short term, because they will solve many of the problems we know from agriculture. But in the long term, it might be necessary, because the climatic conditions when we come into sort of the second half or the end of the century will be so radically different that our current crops might not actually be very useful. And I think it's fair enough to say that they are poor material for genetic improvement, because they have been under selection for so long time that they have lost much of the genetic diversity that could be otherwise harnessed to create crops that would survive in the future. And of course, geographically, we are looking at 60, 70, 80 years into the future, we will see a radically different world when it comes to climate, and therefore we need new and better crops in the long term, preferably perennial ones. So now I would like to stop sharing my screen and ask if Tim would like to continue and show the alternative to the current.
Thank you all, and sorry for the delays today, and thank you, Lennart. This will dovetail very, very nicely, I think. Thank you to Fiona and Julia for the opportunity to present, and I wish I was there in person, but this will do. So I wanted to focus on the concept of ecological intensification today. And I think it may not be obvious how that fits into Lennart's talk, but I think it will become obvious. First, just to point out where I am specifically in the US, Kansas is basically right in the middle of the country, and Salina is just a little bit east of the center of Kansas. So pretty far from the ocean here. In order to talk about ecological intensification, I think it's useful to juxtapose it with input intensification, which is the approach that stood or undergirded success of the Green Revolution, which was very specifically focused on yield of wheat in particular, with respect to Norman Borlaug at Cimet in Mexico, where they'd had a shuttle breeding program and accomplished remarkable yield increases in my lifetime that are controversial in some respects to understand what drove what population growth and economic development versus yields. But there's no question of what happened on the ground in terms of wheat yields in the Green Revolution, and how these were accomplished, though, by intensification of inputs, especially fertilizer, especially nitrogen, but other elements as well. And so the similar curves in yield and fertilizer use, but also pesticide applications over a similar period of time have really, been essential for what has been accomplished in agronomically driven yield increases in my lifetime, is very much sustaining a lot of the world's calories right now. Oh, and I think it's also important to note that most of these inputs were achieved with fossil fuels as feedstocks or sources of energy to power their application. We've successfully applied fossil fuels to relax or eliminate virtually every important ecological limiting factor in agriculture. And it's interesting to juxtapose human versus fossil fuel energy expenditures in North American corn production over the last few hundred years. And of course, I know that the intensification of fossil energy use in agriculture has resulted in just the yield increases we saw. But this underscores how dependent those yield increases are on the expenditure of fossil fuels. So at the end of the 20th century and into this century, the long-term sustainability of input intensification has been called into question. There's been a lot of pretty high-level publications. This is an example of one that Foley and colleagues published in 2011 in Nature. It's cited all the time. And it's not uncommon to see a call for revolutionary approaches to new agricultural systems that will maintain yields, but do it with far less environmentally damaging and economically expensive inputs, if we're really going to get where we need to go to protect natural biodiversity and feed humans. But the calls for this kind of change often fall short of what seems to be available. And the news keeps coming. Reading the chapter that Lennart co-authored in this 2019 special report on land degradation, IPCC report, is a similar call to change, for pretty radical change to address the climate challenges we have. One approach, one response to this call, and it actually dates back now 23 years, is ecological intensification. Ken Kasman, who is retired, but a very well-known agronomist from the University of Nebraska, and actually was honored in 2017 by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, you might know, with the Bertebos Prize. I'm sure I'm not quite saying that right. But ironically, so Ken was really the first one to coin the definition and give it traction of ecological intensification. But ironically, he did not focus so much on the integration of ecological features or processes into agriculture to supplant purchased inputs, but rather he primarily focused on the efficient use of resource-expensive inputs, such as variable rate fertilizer applications and highly efficient sprinkler irrigation. So those are examples of Ken as an agronomist's approach to ecological intensification. Here you can see the citations that use the term ecological intensification before 1999. There were a few, but when his paper came out, the y-axis changed dramatically. Citations after Kasman, and you can see that over these years, the term has gained a lot of traction. And while Kasman is still kind of in the lead as the single paper with the most citations for ecological intensification, 1,813 as of yesterday, there's some people catching up, and one of them may be on this webinar. But if he's not, he's close to you all, and that is Ricardo Bamarco's et al.'s paper in 2013 in Tree, really, along with some other European publications, shifted the discussion from kind of the technological intensification, in essence, that Kasman was promoting, to something far more ecological, focusing more on community ecology. So papers that followed, many of them again are from Europe, use the term ecological intensification to increase crop productivity by enhancing biodiversity and associated ecosystem services. So biodiversity has really become kind of the cornerstone and the focus of most of the work in ecological intensification. At least it's the dominant concept. Here's another example from a paper in Nature in 2016, multi-country evidence that crop diversification promotes ecological intensification in agriculture. And so the European influence on shifting the definition of ecological intensification from technological management of resources to community scale ecological interactions has been essential in advancing this approach to redesigning agriculture that yields sufficient food by relying on ecological processes as opposed to economically and environmentally expensive inputs. But if we're going to achieve the type of revolutionary change, the new type of agricultural system that Foley was and others have referred to and identified, we will need to further expand ecological intensification into other subdisciplines of ecology. At least that's what I'm suggesting in this talk. So let me illustrate what I'm talking about here. This is one of the spider diagrams where whatever function it is that's listed around the perimeter is its efficacy on the ground increases as you go out. And it's relative. This is just a thought model. It's not based on real data right here. But this is what a spider diagram might look like for various ecosystem services achieved by what we might call ecological intensification in an annual cropping system, in a hypothetical annual monocropped grain system. And with today's focus on community ecology and particularly crop biodiversity, oh, excuse me, I forgot this part. These functions around the perimeter actually fall into the four categories that I was just describing. The population, species, scale, community ecology focused on diversity, ecosystem ecology, and we'll talk more about that in terms of succession, and then landscape ecology. And today, when we think of ecological intensification, this is where most of the focus is, I'm talking about. So resource concentration through resource partitioning or niche partitioning and pest regulation with diversity, weed suppression, integration of nitrogen fixers, all of these are achieved with greater diversity in cropping systems and well-designed diversity. But if we move into these other realms very intentionally, and some of them are being worked on, but not quite as holistically, just in terms of ecological intensification. We need to address the design of our agricultural systems across the board holistically in all of these realms to achieve the type of functions that we're after, something that might even approach what natural systems accomplish with very, very few inputs. And so I want to spend a few minutes focusing on population, species, and ecosystem ecology as subdisciplines that, with more attention, could profoundly improve on what has been achieved to date in ecological intensification. And then I'll elaborate a little more on a specific case of soil organic matter, just to illustrate further what I'm describing. Before I do that, though, it's worth pointing out just something that exists in nature, almost the only thing that exists in nature, and that is perennial plants. virtually all natural systems are dominated by perennial vegetation. Annuals are in there, but they contribute a relatively minor percentage of net primary productivity in most natural systems. In fact, it is this sustained investment of carbon below ground by perennial vegetation that has built the soils that we farm in agriculture. And it's an interesting question whether a soil, as we think of it, could be built or developed under annual plants exclusively. But that's another talk. Needless to say, in our annual cropping systems, in order to allow seedlings an opportunity to establish and grow, we kill every plant on the landscape on an annual basis at some scale. And this has happened throughout time in agriculture. We do it on an industrial scale now with fossil fuels, as we've talked about, but it has defined annual agriculture since its inception. So there's several things in these two photos of our food-producing ecosystem that one virtually never sees in native ecosystems. Ecosystems comprised of one plant species, even one genotype. Ecosystems comprised of annuals, and ecosystems with this degree of persistent disturbance. So many would consider succession a community ecology concept, but here I'm using it to illustrate ecosystem functions that develop as a consequence of succession. And four that stand out, and Lennart's already mentioned them to some extent, is actual soil formation and structure, carbon accumulation, nutrient retention, soil microbiome function, and precipitation use or uptake efficiency. Are examples of functions that improve or develop more fully as one moves from a highly disturbed state into a mid-successional state ecologically. And I want to just focus on the carbon accumulation topic here for a minute, just because it is obviously receiving a lot of attention these days. Sometimes too much attention, but so much carbon has been lost from agricultural soils that it is an obvious sink that could, in theory, be filled again to draw down some of the carbon that is in the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of attention at the FAO, and I took a screenshot here of this request for proposals that just came out this week from the USDA. It's been awaited with, everybody's been talking about this, but it is close to $1 billion that the USDA is going to be funding projects for drawing down carbon in agricultural landscapes. So what has happened to these carbon stocks formed under native vegetation when we cleared vegetation by plowing up its roots? Well, a lot of it has been lost as carbon dioxide, as Lennart pointed out. Numbers range from, 20 to 80%, with the middle range being the most common. And of course, when we break open what is physically protected, oftentimes particulate organic carbon, it exposes that carbon to increased microbial attack and oxidation, and we lose carbon as carbon dioxide because of accelerated mineralization. And then on the flip side of that, we're adding far less carbon when we're growing annual crops relative to typical deep-rooted perennial vegetation. In grasslands, we have on the order of 52 to 67% is common below ground net primary production numbers, whereas 15 to 25% is common in annual grain crops in terms of percent of net primary productivity going below ground. So by losing more because of microbial respiration and adding less by shifting from perennials to annuals, we have decrease soil organic carbon contents across the planet in agricultural landscapes. And this really, these two sites in Nebraska and Canada bracket sort of the range that's typical in terms of soil carbon loss following conversion from perennial vegetation to annual cropland. And so if we shift those lands that have been maintained under tillage to perennial grains, what happens? These are results from a eddy covariance tower study that was undertaken here at the Land Institute over 5 years. And the postdoc, Gabriela de Oliveira, found that on the order of 14.7 tons of carbon per hectare were drawn down over the course of the study, on average 3.7 tons per hectare per year. But you can see the net ecosystem carbon accumulation goes down substantially over this time every year after the peak in 2014 in this case. And that's because most of the carbon that's being acquired is in the actual vegetation itself. And as respiration starts to catch up with carbon fixation and photosynthesis, we're approaching a net carbon balance of 0, but we won't get there because this system is actually accumulating stable soil carbon. So the carbon accumulation in a converted landscape happens in 2 phases. The first is going to be a big slug of carbon as you shift from annual vegetation that disappears every year to a net sink of a basic, like a vegetation shift, sort of like what happens in reforestation. And then you have gradual sequestration of soil carbon. And in a study over 16 years, very close to where that eddy covariance tower was, same soil series and everything, it's a mollisol. We have found on about carbon sequestered in intermediate wheatgrass per year over 16 years, compared to annual experiments that are in the same. So when you take that function, and that was a monocropped intermediate wheatgrass, by the way, then when you add diversity, there's a lot of reasons, a lot of theoretical reasons, and this experiment shows them play out, that you would expect to see increases in soil carbon concentration and root storage as you increase the number of plant species in the system. And so this is over 22 years at Cedar Creek, a long-term ecological research site in Minnesota. These are wild perennial species. And as you add species, we can see you increase the soil concentration substantially, and similar to soil carbon storage over 22 years. So just to kind of summarize where we're at right now in the talk, before I shift gears with my remaining minutes, I just wanted to underscore how both diversity and perennialism, and perennialism is happening at the ecosystem scale of ecology, but it's happening also at the individual population species level, because that is where the breeding takes place. So we're focusing on those 2 scales of ecology or subdisciplines. When you add that to community ecology, which is diversity, can move agriculture towards ecological intensification. Either one of them, perennialism or diversity, actually improves in almost all of these ecosystem services if you add them to agriculture. But if you add them together, the synergy between those 2 is exceptional relative to either one added alone. But of course, we need those perennial species to achieve any of this ecological intensification that I'm talking about. It's very hypothetical for the most part. And so I just want to describe some recent progress in this area right now. And it's going to be a quick overview, but hopefully it'll provide some insight into the approaches people are taking and challenges and successes that we're having. The two approaches to develop a perennial grain are where we cross a already existing, often elite annual crop with a perennial relative to introgress perennialism, if you will, into the annual. And I should say, Anna Westerberg, who I believe is at this webinar and very close to you all, she is actually shifting the barley strategy more towards de novo domestication, but both approaches for perennializing barley are at least theoretically possible. So I'm going to touch on each of these briefly. Probably the most successful wide hybrid cross is the Perennial Rice project at Yunnan University in China, the province of Yunnan. And it's achieved by crossing annual rice with a perennial cousin from Africa, Oryza longistaminata, to get at a perennial rice that we see there on the right. And this hybrid has been released commercially now. It grows for 4 to 5 years, 2 harvests per year that are very close to the annual check in that region. And it is being trialed in Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam. There's currently over 7,000 hectares planted, which is not a lot, but it is really recent that it has been released. And work is very much still ongoing in terms of breeding for traits that could use improvement. But it is by far and away the most impressive proof of concept of the wide hybrid cross and the ability to have high yielding perennials in the first place. Here at the Land Institute, we've made considerable progress with perennial sorghum, crossing annual sorghum bicolor with sorghum halopense, a perennial, obviously in the same genus. And most recently, the group working on this has developed a diploid perennial, which makes it much easier to cross with annual sorghum in various settings. And it's very exciting, this accomplishment. Previously, halopense was just tetraploid, and that really made the breeding far more cumbersome. This is a shot of the rhizome under the perennial sorghum, and nothing like that exists under the annual sorghum. So the development of this diploid perennial makes possible work sooner than later, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but other countries as well too, in the tropics or subtropics, that focus on perenniality and adaptation to different soil types and cropping settings, different disease backgrounds. Whereas before, and we're continuing this, the sorghum program that existed here in Salina was focused more on winter hardiness because the hybrid is challenged to persist as a perennial in the cold Kansas winters. So it is a happier cross in the tropical or subtropical regions where sorghum originated, but we are still working to advance its distribution into colder latitudes. Perennial wheat is a cross between durum wheat in our case, at least that's the hybrid that is showing greatest success is durum wheat, with Thinopyrum intermedium, a relative of wheat. And a lot of focus has gone into looking at the flowering time genes triggering vernalization in this hybrid cross. That has been part of the greatest challenge in achieving perennialism, is getting consistency in the flowering time genes that are controlling vernalization. But Xuan Wang, who is the lead breeder in this area, has made considerable improvements by increasing the ratio of wheatgrass in the wide hybrid cross with the durum wheat in recent years. The other approach to developing perennial grain crops is de novo domestication, or taking wild plant species and breeding them to become agricultural species. And this is a much, it takes longer than the wide hybrid crosses, or it can take longer, but there's kind of predictable progress with this in iterative cycles of breeding and selection year after year. One of the species we're working on would be a sunflower or oilseed replacement that is perennial. Silphium integrifolium is a native to the American prairie and or Great Plains, and its number of seeds corresponds to the number of ray flower petals that you see, and so it makes it easy to select for number of seeds just by the flower itself. There you can see what it looks like as a stalk. And this is partly why we're so interested in it, is it's proven to be extremely drought tolerant during some serious dry years in 2011, 2012. That's when we shifted a lot of our focus towards this species. Those roots go very deep, and when annual sunflower was basically dying, this plant barely noticed that there was a drought, so we were very interested in that crop. Sainfoin is a legume that has been grown as a forage species in Europe, and it's well adapted to slightly more arid conditions than alfalfa, and we are working on it as a perennial legume oil for plant protein crop. And our legume breeder is also taking forage legumes like Cura clover and working to develop perennial ground covers into which annual crops might be sown as a nearer term perennialization, if you will, of the landscape, with annual crops growing in that backdrop. The de novo domestication project that's received probably the most attention at the Land Institute is Kernza, which is intermediate wheatgrass, the same perennial that we're crossing with wheat. And it is from Eurasia, and we had practiced traditional selection in the field, phenotypic selection, for years and made some progress. But that progress has been accelerated dramatically in the last few years when we shifted to genomic selection, and coupled with phenotypic selection, there's considerable progress being made. Here's increases in grain yield in kilograms per hectare and seed mass size in milligrams per seed over 8 breeding cycles. And there's been 3 breeding cycles that have continued to linearly extrapolate since this figure was made. And we're very optimistic that we can approach wheat on the order of 20, 23 years. And if we instigate a second round of genomic selection per year, that rate could even be cut in half to something like 10 to 13 years. To achieve yields that are comparable to wheat. Kernza is already being made into quite a few products. There's breakfast, there's some dinner, there's definitely happy hour. A lot of beers are being made, and some spirits. And pasta just came out also that is based on Kernza. So just to wrap up some of the pluses and minuses of these 2 different approaches, wide hybridization and de novo domestication. Plus of the de novo domestication is that these are robust perennials to begin with. And so they're very hard to kill, actually, once you have them well established. Whereas in the wide hybrid crosses, genetic compatibilities between the annual and the perennial can challenge perenniality, and that becomes a primary focus of breeding programs in white hybridization, is stabilizing that perenniality. A negative in terms of de novo domestication is the relatively small seed size that typically exists with the plants when you start. And while there's iterative process gains, you're starting with something, as we saw in Kernza, that is not comparable to the current grains that we're reliant on. Whereas the white hybridization approach tends to capture many traits from that elite annual grain being crossed with a wild perennial, and therefore you get a head start on seed qualities and other attributes that are desirable. And finally, the de novo domestication tends to result in steady, predictable crop improvements over decades, with rounds of selective phenotypic and now genomic selection, whereas the white hybridization is kind of a roll of the dice. And it's remarkable actually how fast people in China, the researchers in China, were able to develop a perennial rice. I mean, literally 20 years, which if you think of a new crop species, is quite remarkable. So it does show it's possible, but there's a lot of, yeah, you can't predict when those dice are gonna all roll sixes. So I think that I hopefully have given an example of how breeding at the population species scale can affect the ecosystem scale to move to a later stage of succession. We're also doing ecological intensification in terms of breeding for rust resistance and other ecologically relevant traits. In terms of community ecology, improving pollinator habitat with perennial grains is a consideration. We can see the flowering times of the prairie, the time when there's pollinator resources available. And so piecing together perennial crop resources so that we're able to sustain the pollinator diversity is a focus of some of our work right now. And another talk that I'd love to give is the work that I've done on whether perennial cereal can be grown without reliance on synthetic nitrogen by intercropping typically nitrogen fixing forage species with the perennial grains such as Kernza. And I'll just say that you run into a lot of nitrogen limitation when you sow them at the same time, not surprisingly, in an intercrop system, as is true even with annual cereal legume intercrops, but that we're moving towards experimentation with front-loading nitrogen in a perennial forage for 2 to 3 years, and then undercutting strips into that forage to establish, in this case, to establish Kernza. That was an accident. And this is showing a great deal of promise in terms of avoiding some profound nitrogen limitation early in the cropping cycle. It tends to take 2 to 3 years to develop enough organic nitrogen in the soil to sustain the grain. A lot of this work involves groups all over North America and the rest of the world. And so we're starting a New Roots International initiative right now to try to expand this research into other regions. But Sweden is certainly one, and SLU is already very involved, as Lennart mentioned earlier. And we're very grateful to have fantastic colleagues there and increasingly in other parts of Europe as well to help advance this work. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lennart to wrap up the presentation, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
We started this, the whole idea of making a perennial vision come true is the theoretically informed critique of what we have. The investigation of what alternatives can be, and I hope that Tim has convinced everybody that there is the perennial cropping system is an alternative that is desirable, it's viable, and it is achievable. So next step would then be to, okay, so what is the best strategy to make this happen? Because I can sort of like an anecdote, when I first met Wes Jackson about 15 years ago, and we had a conversation, and he was so convinced that once we have bred these fantastic crops, they will just spread like magic all over the world. And I said, no, I don't think so, because when you start to become successful, then you will challenge very important and powerful interests that don't want this to happen. So I think that's why we have to be really careful to think about the strategy to make it happen. So here, and this is also the third step of Eric Olin Wright's strategy for envisioning real utopias. So who are the winners? I think that's fairly clear here. The environment would be a winner. We also think that farmers would be a winner. And so there will be many winners, but who are the losers? And what are the barriers for this to happen? That's where we need to understand this much better than we do today, I think. And then secondly, what social forces can be mobilized to make this happen? Because there is no technology that will just, except perhaps Facebook and Twitter, that will just spread by itself. It needs sort of forces need to be mobilized to make it happen. So first, who are the winners? First of all, I start with this one. It shows on the x-axis the time from 1990 up till now, and on the y-axis it shows the number of weed species that have become resistant to the most widely used herbicide, glyphosate. And we can see this phenomenal, once glyphosate was introduced at a larger scale, we can see this massive increase in the number of species that become resistant. So here I say, if your business is to manage a problem, of course you don't want that problem to go away. Because if you solve the problem, then of course you'll also lose your business idea. And this is, I think, a core of the problem. And later on, I will also try to put this in a more sort of theory of science context. So here is, if you study what the big giants on the agrochemical and seed industry, what they think about this. Here are quotes from three of the very big ones, Monsanto annual report in 2017, the first one. And I have highlighted here what they are doing is that they are looking at integrated yield solutions that involves the integration here is plant breeding, biotechnology, chemistry, and data science. And Corteva, which is this new company that was created a few years ago after the merger of Dow and DuPont agrochemical companies, they aim at a balanced and diverse mix of seed, crop protection, and digital solutions. And very similar message we get from Bayer, who actually recently bought Monsanto. It's seeds and it's crop protection and digital. So they're all, and especially when we recognize or realize that these companies are the main source of funding, the main developer of new seeds. So they are not really looking at how can we minimize the use of chemicals, for example. Instead, how do you make them into a package? And that this packaging, I think, is a particular challenge to break for perennial cropping systems to be successful. And here's, of course, you may have seen this picture many times before, but in case you haven't, I think it's such a strong message here. What it shows is this incredible structural change in the economy, in the world economy of agriculture inputs that have happened over the last couple of decades. In red are companies that are primarily agrochemical based. In blue are all the companies that are primarily seed developers. And in green are some other agriculture inputs companies, for example, machinery and so forth. And what we have seen is this incredible shopping spree. So Monsanto was first already in the 1980s, went on a shopping spree of buying up seed companies. So the chemical company acquired many of the seed companies. More recently, Bayer in Europe had been on a similar shopping spree of seed companies in Europe. And then in 2018, Bayer acquired Monsanto to create this enormous cloud. And the size of these companies is in relation to the size of the companies. And we can see, for example, the Corteva that I alluded to before, that was the merger of DuPont and Dow. We see a similar, and here is the ChemChina, which is partly China government controlled company that bought up Syngenta and so they had very little seed industry themselves. So they acquired Syngenta and got a lot of seed companies. So this is, of course, all these companies, they are sort of perennial crops are not in the interest of these corporations, of course. We can also see how they are very powerful of trying to influence the politics. So here shows, because in Europe, herbicides, and in particular glyphosate, is under a lot of discussion, and the renewal of the license has been a discussion point for a long time in EU. And we can see how the agrochemical industry is spending a lot of effort, a lot of money on lobbying. So lobbying the EU, the environment, the EU Directorate General Environment, Agriculture and Health, and the head office of the European Commission as well, and the various parliamentarian groups. So they have a very, very sort of deep knowledge about how decisions are made, when, by whom, and so forth. And together, these groups spend about, what is it, 500 million Swedish kronor, so 46 million euro on lobbying in 2 years, in trying to sort of change their political decisions. And of course, lobbying is not a cheap thing, so that requires a lot of resources. So here is another sort of barrier to a perennial vision to come forward. The corporations also practiced a very strong and old tool of integration, vertical integration and horizontal. Vertical, so that the chemical industry acquired the seed industry, and they also getting increasingly into the digital industry and so forth. And of course, they make also links with the retail and the food processing industry. And we have these also the geographic, we've seen increasing globalization of control over the food sector. So that is a tall order for a radically new way of doing agriculture to survive and come forward. And we can see that this is one of the most economically consolidated areas we have. Economists talk about concentration ratio. That is when the 5 largest corporations, if they control, or if they have more than 60% of the total market, then it is an oligopoly. And the concentration ratio is 75% in agrochemicals, and probably increasing all the time as they acquire more and more. So this is, of course, heavy or difficult for somebody to challenge. But then there's a question, is there a Jevons paradox in agriculture? I suppose you know what Jevons paradox is, but it comes from energy, and the paradox is that the more energy efficient we become, the more we use energy. So it's actually in the interest of energy producers to make it energy efficient, because then we will consume more. So Jevons paradox has been It was described already in 1865 by the economist in his book, The Coal Question. So here is some quotes from Business Intelligence about digital agriculture or precision farming. So this fantastic technology, See and Spray, that has the potential to reduce the herbicide use by 40 to 50%. So it's a device that can distinguish between a plant and a soil and only spray on the plant and not on the bare soil. Future versions of See and Spray that will be able to differentiate between crop and weed. So it will boost the efficiency to 70 to 90%. So you can have this fantastic opportunity within the next few years to reduce the herbicide use by up to 90%. And it is happening. The global agriculture IoT stands for Internet of Things. This is also from another Business Intelligence. They were counting on a 94% increase in 5 years in terms of money, in terms of how much money there will be spent on these kinds of technologies. And it's actually happening in terms of devices. Here we show the actual number of GPS satellite systems that are installed in tractors around the world. We see a tremendous increase, 350% increase in 10 years. So it's actually happening. There's fantastic revolution that could actually reduce the use of herbicides quite a lot. But if we look at another Business Intelligence report from the agrochemicals, so here is what they project. They project a 39% increase over the next 10 years of agrochemical use. So something is wrong here, because if the previous message about the reduction because of precision farming, if that would be correct, we would actually see a reduction of the herbicides. So I think there is a case of Jevons paradox. Now I would like to just end with a few words about how we can think about this more from a theory of science point of view. What kind of science is practiced and at work here? So this is a quote from Wes Jackson. Wes Jackson is the guy who founded the Land Institute, where Tim is, and also one of sort of the pioneer when it comes to thinking about perennial cropping systems. And here is a quote from one of his book. I talked to my geneticist and ecologist colleagues about the possibility of perennial grain polyculture. And their response was something like, "Oh, well, Wes, everybody knows that it's not possible. The plant will either allocate its resources to the root or to the seed, but it can't do both, Wes. You should understand that." So then Wes asked, "Yeah, but how about fruit trees? They're high yielding." But then that was considered different because they are woody. But what does that have to do with trade-off? So this is a conversation he's having. So he's trying to challenge it from a sort of he's trying to challenge his geneticist friends, but they don't really buy it because they are probably part of a very strong paradigm. Paradigm, of course, as everybody knows, that he was coined by Thomas Kuhn in the early 1960s in his absolutely oversold book, I would say, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So he says that science is going through these phases. We have the pre-science, when a scientific paradigm is being established, when there's still uncertainties, but you are strengthening the science more and more. And then you come into a period of normal science. That is the status quo, when all the science, or most of the science at least, is aimed at just strengthening this paradigm that's already existing. We think we know how things work, and then we have normal science. But then gradually, there are more and more results that start to challenge the paradigm. Perhaps something is not right in our theoretical understanding. So that's when we have model drift. More and more results deviate from what we would expect. And then we come to a period of crisis when the current paradigm is actually threatened or challenged. And if it's challenged enough, there will be a revolution and a paradigm shift eventually. So this is Thomas Kuhn's way to look at it. And within normal science, which I think we still are, perhaps we have come into a model drift where more and more, I mean, it's nowadays quite common to say that our agricultural system has to change, like Jonathan Foley, the paper that Tim referred to. But what is our pursuit of knowledge during normal science is very much used on what we call the scientific method. This is what we teach in high schools and college, and our students come. And it's very much inductive based. We start with observations, problems in the field, problems in reality, and we try to explain them. And it has served us well. But can it save us as well? No, I don't think so. We need to think differently for the future. And then we can illustrate this with another great theory of as a scholar in the theory of science, Imre Lakatos. He's not as famous as Thomas Kuhn, but he has provided a view on science which I think can be very, very useful for understanding how agriculture as a knowledge field, how it operates and how it develops. What Lakatos said was, he said that in a research program, in a field, there is a hard core. That is, nobody really challenges that. And in agriculture, we can call this hard core the annual plants. Annual plants, that is the mainstay of agriculture. It might not be scientifically created, but it's more created what we call in Swedish beprövad erfarenhet, which means that it's something which has emerged through practice and experience rather than purely scientific. So we have, for thousands of years, we have established the hardcore agriculture is the dependence on annual plants. Then Lakatos says, around this hardcore, there is always a protective belt of science. And in this case, we have agronomy. We have established, created a particular field of the sciences. We call it agronomy, which is of course a very wide field, but its aim is to protect the hardcore. And this is what Lakatos was interested in, the pure sort of knowledge, the epistemic levels of it. But now I think we need to add a more political, economic, or societal level. And there is a protective belt of what we can call the agrochemical industrial complex. Because that's where most of the research, for example, in plant breeding, most of the research in plant breeding is done by these stakeholders. They are major funders of research and so forth. So they are sort of, and we also have, of course, a political system that is together with the private interest here, maintaining the hardcore and the science, determining what kind of science is funded, what is not funded. It's not a surprise that most of the Land Institute's research has been funded by very sort of different types of funding sources. It's not the conventional research funding. It is very sort of philanthropist driven to a large extent. And then, of course, what comes here? Here comes then the idea of perennial polycultures, which actually goes right into challenging the idea of annual plants, like Wes illustrated. It challenges a lot of the science around it. And of course, it challenges the protective belt from the agrochemical industrial complex. It's a tall order to make this happen. But I will end with this on a very positive note. And it shows the early days, not early, I mean, wheat started about 10,000 years ago, but sort of a semi-early days of wheat yields. So here is from the the yield of wheat was very, very sort of slowly increasing for a long time. Here goes back to 1860. And then around 1940, when more scientific and organized plant breeding started, and it started to grow very rapidly. So between 1940 and 1969, there was a 2.23% increase in the yield per year from 950 kilograms per hectare to 1875. And the pictures that Tim showed before about the increase in yield of intermediate wheatgrass, Kernza, is actually 9% per breeding cycle. So I think that there is a very, very good reason for optimism that it is possible within the actually foreseeable future to develop intermediate wheatgrass to something that is that can actually challenge conventional wheat. If this is then introduced at the world level, I just made a little experiment, sort of back of the envelope calculation here. The bars here comes from a fairly recent paper about the global food system and how much the emission of carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's not only carbon dioxide. How much? So business as usual will consume almost the entire carbon budget if we want to have a 67% chance of reaching the 2 degrees target, which means that there is almost no room for any other emission, which is highly unlikely, of course, because we have fossil fuel on top of this. Then they have various scenarios of agricultural development, how much that could do. So if we changed our diets to really get rid of meat, in a sense, that would lower the total emission to this, close to actually reaching the 1.5 perhaps. And I've added here the bar here. If we replace 60% of cereals, oilseeds, and pulses by perennials from 2040, then that would correspond to this kind of drawdown of carbon and make climate change much more achievable, I think. So there is a fantastic potential, but a lot of resistance for this to happen because there will be many losers. No, there will be a few losers, but they are powerful. So with that, I would like to stop talking.